Last week marked the one-year anniversary of the shameless and cowardly attack and murders at Charlie Hebdo, the satirical paper and cartoon publisher in Paris, France. What happened since then has been kind of interesting and sad to behold, because a lot of people are misunderstanding what freedom of speech is for. But at least the discussion has started. This is Liberty Talk 48. I'm Rick Funk. One year ago, the whole world was saying, "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie, until a lot of people realized that Charlie Hebdo was actually satirical, and they were really satirical, as in they were heckling people, they were making fun of people, they were making fun of people's beliefs, which obviously is part of heckling people and heckling people's ideas. So there was a backlash. All of us, after about a week, people came out and saying, "No, I am not Charlie, because this is not okay." And at that point, people just went completely off the rails as to what freedom of speech is for. Some people were so far out, they really didn't even reflect any sunlight any longer. So, 1 year later, things are worse than ever. There is a serious confusion about what freedom of speech is and how important it is. Without freedom of speech, without that single liberty, you cannot even discuss the existence of other liberties. If we hadn't had freedom of speech, and insane, repulsive, and offensive ideas had been able to be aired and discussed, we wouldn't have those rights today that once were considered offensive to even discuss. Like a very ordinary observation that people should have the same rights regardless of their melanin content in their epidermis. This was once an offensive idea. If we hadn't had freedom of speech, that would not have been the right today. There are many similar rights. So here's the thing. It doesn't matter whether people found Charlie Hebdo funny, and that's the whole point of freedom of speech. So what are people saying is more important? Why did people have a backlash? Students at universities in the United States are going completely off the rails and talk about a right to be emotionally comfortable as somehow more important than freedom of speech. In Germany, people are talking about a fuzzy right to decency as more important, whatever that means. It can mean anything. Am I feeling decent? Am I not feeling decent? Do I get to say if other people are decent or not? That's a dangerous path. And fundamentalist Islamists are claiming that freedom of speech does somehow not involve a right to offend. This is where you're just saying that black is white, up is down, and disappear at the next zebra crossing in the words of Douglas Adams. Freedom of speech is the right to offend. Freedom of speech is precisely the right to say what other people don't want you to say, regardless of their reason or conviction. That's why it didn't matter whether you agreed with what Charlie Hebdo said. That's why it doesn't matter whether you like their humor. The fact that they were saying something that other people didn't like is exactly why they should be defended at all costs. Freedom of speech was never needed to say that kittens are cute and cuddly. You don't need to defend a right to say what's agreeable, and you don't need the right to defend those in power. This is black and white. There is no gray area here. Freedom of speech is the right for idiots to be completely wrong, and that's a good thing. It's very important to realize that that's a good thing. You have 4 cases here in a quadrant, yeah? You have powerful people and powerless people who say things that are acceptable or offensive. When powerful people say things that are acceptable, that's a no-brainer. When powerless people say things that are acceptable, like kittens are cuddly, nobody bats an eyelash. When powerful people say things that are offensive, they are at worst seen as a little eccentric. And maybe there's a notice in some paper. It's when the powerless say something that is offensive that freedom of speech becomes absolutely vital. And the reason is that they may be right. It may be perfectly reasonable to afford the same rights to people regardless of the melanin content in their skin. It may be perfectly right to afford the same rights to people regardless of their sexual preference. It may be perfectly right to be able to discuss future rights, even if they are considered offensive today. Freedom of speech is the right for idiots to be completely wrong, and that's a good thing, because they sometimes turn out to be the ones in the right. It was once offensive to suggest that the earth revolved around the sun. Other people have said a lot on this issue. Rowan Atkinson said that the freedom to criticize ideas, any ideas, even if they're sincerely held beliefs, is one of the fundamental freedoms in society. Salman Rushdie, whom you'll know was not very popular with people who he had apparently offended, said that what is freedom of speech? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist. And as liberty stands against surveillance, let's also add a quote from George Orwell, saying that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Last but not least, freedom of speech is precisely the right to say what other people don't want you to say, regardless of their reason or conviction, which was said by me 5 minutes ago. We've got a commentator today who was actually in a lot of media 1 year ago after the murders and shameless attack on Charlie Hebdo. We've got Charlie Hebdo here, who's a very well-known liberty activist in Scandinavia, who's very outspoken, not just on liberty and freedom of speech, but on autonomy and libertarian issues overall. So welcome to the show, Kalle.
Thank you very much.
We've pulled a lot of strings here starting up this show. What's your take on all of this?
Well, first of all, of course, I always used to say that my right to freedom of speech is much more important than your right not to be offended. And it's actually quite obvious, because I can't know in what will make you offended. If we're going to outlaw everything that may offend someone, we cannot say anything, because everything can offend someone. Someone may be offended by anything anyone can say. So we can't really go there. And there's one very important issue here, that nobody knows everything about anything, actually. Everyone is wrong at some times. Even those people who really know a lot of things, people who are really experts, people who have huge, vast amounts of knowledge, they may be wrong. And someone else may point that out. And if it's not allowed to point that out, the faults will continue. So if that person who actually is wrong will be offended by someone pointing out that you're wrong, my sir, that will actually stop all development, stop everything going forward. So it's really important that that people are free to say and think whatever they want. And of course, as you also put out, I may be an idiot. I may say really stupid things, but who's to judge? Who will know? Like in the future, it may actually show that I was right all the time.
Exactly.
And
you bring
everyone
up a
else
very
is wrong.
important point here. I mean, you're saying that if somebody is offended, you cannot say anything. But it's not about the 7 billion people, coming up on 8 billion people, that somewhere somebody might be offended. It's freedom of speech has always been restricted to protect the powerful, hasn't it? It's never about if somebody powerless in some slum ghetto somewhere might be offended.
No, that's not important.
Laws never
that's not
changed to
important
that.
to
There's
people in
another
power.
quote here from Kenan Malik, just yesterday actually, saying that once we give up the freedom to offend in the name of tolerance or respect, we constrain our ability to challenge those in power, and therefore to challenge injustice.
Yes, definitely.
And I think this is quite on point, isn't it? Especially looking at Charlie Hebdo.
Yes, and there has been a lot of misunderstanding around Charlie Hebdo. I know that, for example, the Penn Club in America, United States of America, were very critical against Charlie Hebdo because they consider Charlie Hebdo to be racist.
Right.
Which they're not.
Absolutely.
They're not racist.
They just didn't
and a
understand
lot
the
of
French humor, did
journalists
they?
also in Sweden claim they were racist because they were seeing their kind of humor and thought, oh, these cartoons are very, very offensive to black people, to Muslims, to Christians, to all kinds of people. And so they must be racist. The thing is, they don't understand French humor. It's a very particular kind of intellectual tradition where you tweak something says something really stupid, and then you tweak it and make it even more stupid.
Exactly.
Kind of humor.
And you show the absurdity.
Sweden, we have this comedy gang called Grotesco. They were singing a song that everything is the fault of the gays.
Right.
You know that one. It's det är bögarnas fel. It's everything that is wrong is because of gays. And of course, if you're a stupid person, you will think that they are serious singing that song. But they're not, of course, and that's the same with Charlie Hebdo. They're not more racist than this Swedish comedy group is homophobic. It's a satire.
Exactly.
It's an intellectual kind of humor, and of course, a lot of people don't understand intellectual humor, but then they judge them and say they're racist.
Exactly. I mean,
and
if
even
if they were intellectual,
this is also very important. Even if they were racist, they are still entitled to say what they want. And then you meet them in open debate and you tell them, no, my sir, you're wrong because, and then you have an open debate. I mean, already the Greeks in the ancient antique Greece knew that this is the way to attain knowledge, that you actually meet and discuss things. You don't just put a thing on the ground and say, this is the truth and that's it. That's not how to develop.
That's very important. And I mean, the humor that Charlie Hebdo had, like you point out, was almost mathematically intellectual. I mean, it had a very high level, it required a very high level of intellectual honesty. There is a way of proving things in mathematics that is proving it by contradiction, meaning that if you're looking at a statement, if you're looking at a claim that A equals B or something equals something, and then you start looking at, okay, if we assume this is true, what would be the consequences? And then you start exploring the consequences and you arrive at something completely absurd, therefore proving that A cannot be equal to B to begin with. In Latin, this is a reductio in absurdum.
Yes, and the funny thing about Charlie Hebdo is that they were both really gross. I mean, they can do really gross jokes, but they were extremely intelligent. It was extremely intelligent jokes, gross jokes, which a lot of people don't get them, of course. I mean,
true,
it's obvious.
But like you said, I mean, the point is not whether you agreed with the jokes or not. The point is not whether you agree with the idea. The point is not whether they were outright racist. The point is they still had a...
And unfortunately, we have a situation also are afraid of criticizing Islam because of the threat of violence. Thing is, like Charlie Hebdo, they were criticizing the Pope and Catholicism much more than ever Islam, but that is never mentioned in the discussions. It's always when they have pictures of Muhammad or like they're actually mocking Islam, then they are suddenly racist. And that's really bad, and it's very disrespectful. And of course it's disrespectful. It's supposed to be disrespectful.
Right, that's the
point
the whole
to begin
idea.
with. Well, and also there is a culture clash here because ideas about freedom of speech are very strong in Europe, and particularly, for example, in France. They always had a very strong sense of this freedom of speech. And when that clashes with cultures who never had that idea, of course, there's going to be a conflict.
Right. They did not have the Enlightenment. They didn't go through the Enlightenment.
No.
They didn't learn to challenge authority. They didn't explore liberty. They didn't have liberty ingrained with a deep philosophical foundation into their society.
You mentioned the TV show. I was in one of the media stuff. I was in just right after the murders. I got this, and I had this. This is Charlie Hebdo.
That's their issue right after the attack, isn't it?
Right after the attack. And I was waving around with this in Swedish television, which was quite fun. And I was attacked not like physically, but verbally, by a young Muslim who thought that making, like for example, caricatures of Muhammad was actually a violation of his freedom of religion.
Right.
And that is a big fault. because I am not violating his right to practice his religion, not the least. But he's trying to violate my right to live my life as I want it, because I've never ever tried to stop a Muslim from being a Muslim.
Right.
But
actually, let's explore that a bit. These liberties,
yeah.
they don't really apply between individuals, do they? They're primarily a liberty resting with the individual and being toward the government. As in, you don't need a right from me to say whatever you want. It's a right toward the government to say whatever you want and be free from governmental repercussions. That doesn't mean automatically you're free from social repercussions.
I think it's a right that I should have towards anyone. It's not just about government. It's my personal right. And I personally think that people should be allowed to have Nazi uniforms and wave swastika flags if they want to, because then you know they're idiots. Then you really know they're idiots, and you can just avoid them. It's really very practical. Now they dress up in nice suits, and suddenly they are in the parliament.
There's an interesting culture. There's an interesting difference in culture here between, say, the United States and Germany. I mean, in the United States, you can't express any kind of nudity. And there is something interesting going on with Facebook here. Let's explore that later. But I mean, you cannot dress up in those kinds of uniforms in Germany. You would be arrested. You would be thrown in jail. These rules exist in many European countries. Whereas in the United States, it's seen as freedom of expression. They're not.
Yes, still out.
They have the United States has a much stronger freedom of expression tradition than, say, Europe has. And Europe, again, has a much stronger tradition than, say, the Middle East or most parts of Africa or China.
Most parts of Asia. And of course, during European history, we have had, like during tyrannical dictatorships, there have been breaks in these traditions.
Right.
Like
so is the United States freedom of speech tradition primarily based on the fact that they're, well, more or less the youngest strong republic among countries? I mean, they were founded very recently in terms of civilization's history. So they had the opportunity to bring these Enlightenment ideas of freedom of speech into the Constitution. I mean, the U.S. Constitution is one of the most beautiful legal documents ever written, to be honest.
It's amazing. It's very good. But it was also actually inspired by the Dutch and the Swiss and the Iroquois from Native American, the Iroquois culture. So they have been like getting inspiration from several different sources. And
can you elaborate
the Dutch,
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, because the Dutch had also a strong freedom, political, what do you say? They have a tradition of political freedom. And they also had some kind of constitution that was really very inspiring. And so the Americans, when they were making their own constitution, they were looking at the Magna Carta, the Swiss, the Dutch, and also the Iroquois. So they were looking at many different sources to make their, and they were actually fighting really, really hard. Jefferson and all these guys, they were fighting really hard to keep God out of the Constitution.
Right.
They were heavily criticized for not having God in the Constitution. This one nation under God that you will find on the coins, that came in the 20th century.
It was 1956, wasn't it?
Yeah, somewhere around there. It was like in the middle of the 20th century. So they were really very strict in religious freedom, meaning also being able to be free from religion.
Right, but again, isn't that against the government? Isn't that you cannot be punished or segregated or differentiated because of the ideas you hold, religious ideas being one idea among many?
Of course, there are spots here. I mean,
bear with me here.
Has spots.
Bear with me here a bit. Freedom of speech does, by necessity, also include the right to ridicule others' ideas, yeah?
Oh, yes.
So just because you're free to say something doesn't mean you're free from social repercussions from your peers, including mockery, including maybe not getting a job, including losing friends, and so on and so forth. So
that's true.
Well, what I'm getting at here is that a lot of people are confusing this, that I have a freedom of speech, therefore you must listen to what I say and accept it unconditionally. But freedom of speech is never between individuals in a society, is it? It's just that the government cannot punish you for what you think, what you say, what you express. And so it's important that freedom of speech goes both ways. You have the right to say whatever you like, and I have the right to say you're an absolute idiot.
Yes, exactly, of course, because we all have the same rights.
Exactly.
So Yes. So if I'm saying something that someone finds really stupid, that person has, of course, the same right to say, "You're stupid, man," and explain why, or just say that I'm stupid, and that's their right. And I
Exactly.
have to accept that.
And isn't this
Yes.
why it works? Isn't this why society progresses? Coming full
Yes.
circle
Yes.
here, that when you can challenge power, when you can challenge ideas, it's only
Yeah.
then that you can actually progress.
It's you have to break the rules to actually open up for development. That's like, and that's it's always been like that. You have to break the norm. Otherwise, if you don't step outside the norm, you will never develop, and the society will never develop. That's just the way it is. It has always been.
Exactly. I agree with that. Which is why we're coming back to why freedom of speech must be defended at all costs. The right for people to challenge the power must always be protected by a strong defensive net of safety.
Yes, I would like to just because you mentioned that before that the freedom of speech is not just for the palatable, for the nice things to say. One of the things there's this movie director Milos Forman. He was born in Czechoslovakia, as it was in those days, and his both parents were killed in concentration camps. But he stayed in Czechoslovakia. He started making films. But in 1968, the Russians came. So then he said, not another dictatorship. So he went to the United States, and he made a series of absolutely amazing films like The Cuckoo's Nest, Hair, Amadeus. And he did one film that was particularly about freedom of speech, and that was the film about Larry Flynt, the guy behind the magazine Hustler, which is kind of rather disgusting guy. He was really a disgusting guy, and it's a disgusting magazine, and he was breaking all the rules all the time, making really, just breaking boundaries all the time. And the thing is that's why Milos Forman chose to make a film about him, not like a big social hero. Larry Flynt is not a hero, but he was using his freedom of speech in a way that a lot of people found really, really shocking, and they were offended. But that's why Milos Forman chose him, because it's also like when the Nazis came to Czechoslovakia, they said, let's just get rid of all smut and perverts and porns and stuff, and then people were just cheering and yes, we don't want that. That's really bad. But then suddenly Shakespeare was bad, and then suddenly a lot of stuff was bad and regarded as smut and bad, and suddenly there was no room for any thought.
Right, where you're burning books,
people
you're soon burning
when
people.
people start thinking, can I say this? Can I even think this? Then we are into an Orwellian hell. And the thing is that most people don't even know it when it comes, because it's not like someone is throwing a bag in your head. It comes slowly. The boiling frog thing. It's just coming slowly, and people start watching their words, watching what they say, watching what they write, because maybe the government, someone is hearing what I'm saying, hearing what I'm my opinions. Maybe I just shut up and not say anything, and suddenly we're all just
shutting up a little bit more. Yeah, I said that. I said before. Let's go back to Facebook, and this looks like a very nice segue to that. There is a conflict coming up between property rights and freedoms of speech that whichever way we choose going ahead will have very long-lasting effects. The freedoms we use to exercise in the public square, freedoms of assembly, freedoms of speech, freedoms of expression, even freedoms of thought, have now moved onto private servers, those of Facebook. And there might be another actor in the future, doesn't matter, the principle is still there and will probably be there for this foreseeable future. Now, Facebook is a private company, and therefore have the right to set whatever community standards they like for people hanging out on their servers, as it stands today.
I know
but
that.
The interesting
I know
thing
that
is,
account has been shut down several times, and I've been blocked several times because of American standards when it comes to skin tones, too much nudity and stuff. It's not like I'm putting up porn, but according to Facebook standards, what I do is obviously pornographic or somehow offensive to them. So it's just I've been shut down a few times. I'm learning the rules now.
Right, so you're learning to censor yourself. So where does this lead us as of freedom of speech? I mean, it used to be that the public square, the government guaranteed freedom of speech on the public square. But whether we like it or not, that discussion, that association, that social activity has moved onto private servers, where a private corporation is setting the rules, and they are setting the rules according to the standards wherever they were based, which in this case is the United States, and therefore anything remotely nude is absolutely banned and verboten. Which, if they were based somewhere else, there would be different standards. But how do we have to choose between property rights and freedom of speech here? And if so, how do we go ahead, and what would the consequences be?
Well, you have an interesting point there, because I have a totally different angle when it comes to the property rights. And that is, I saw a really interesting TED Talk with, Nina Paley.
Yes.
The artist who made Sita Sings the Blues.
And is very active in the privacy debate as well.
It's absolute genius. And she actually equates copyright with brain damage.
Yeah.
Which sounds really like, whoa.
No, because you're censoring yourself. It makes perfect sense.
She's making a really good point. Because the self-censorship that starts, and which is really encouraged by copyright rules, the copyright rules have done a lot of harm, because we have no access to most of the culture from the whole of the 20th century.
Yep.
It's like,
correct.
It's just gone.
It's a huge hole if you're looking at available culture from the ages. For whatever copyright monopoly validity span, it's just a huge black hole.
Yeah, we can't use it. We can't, it's because of copyright rules. And the most bizarre thing is that it's sold as we are protecting the rights of the artists, but they're not.
That was never the purpose of the copyright monopoly.
No, and especially it's really funny, because people know that we have a whole culture, a musical culture, which is based on people sampling, like the hip hop culture.
Absolutely.
Which is a whole culture of sampling other people's stuff and making new things with it. And if you look at that in that way, and you see other art forms in the same way, you can't. It's just impossible. There's so much art that cannot be done, that cannot be developed, because it breaks copyright rules. And you can see also, like, for example, the Diary of Anne Frank.
Yeah.
It was just the copyright time was just it just ended, but then they suddenly. The publishing company suddenly made it a point that, well, actually, the father is also a co-writer. So then suddenly they can expand the copyright a few years more.
On the monopoly for another 30 or 40 years or whatever.
If there is something that really, really, really should be public domain, it's the Diary of Anne Frank, right?
There's a lot of argument to be made for that. And in particular, I mean, the justification for this monopoly is, quote, from the U.S. Constitution, which we've already mentioned, to promote the progress of something and the public arts.
Okay.
This scientific progress, I think, and the public arts. But the point here is that the public was always the beneficiary. The method and the means has been to award the author with a temporary monopoly on the opportunity to make money from selling this work. Now, once something is already in existence, that author will not be incentivized any further by extending the monopoly.
No, usually also because the whole copyright thing is
also, Anne Frank is dead,
like 70 years after someone died, which is like even extremely absurd. What would it make? What does it give me if I have copyright on my stuff 70 years after I die? I mean, that's ridiculous.
It is. So how does this bring us back
to? But they're connected. Yes.
So how does this bring us back to the if we have to choose between Facebook exercising property rights over their own servers and enforcing the community guidelines they like, versus the freedoms of speech we used to hold in the public square now not being available when we've moved that association onto Facebook servers. Facebook being whatever service that fills the same role in the future. What happens here?
Well, the biggest problem is when social media becomes like a monopoly. They're not a complete monopoly, but they are very, very, very big. So not being part of Facebook community means that you're sort of shutting a lot of social life out.
Exactly. I mean, if you don't adhere to the censorship rules,
and then you will unconsciously adapt to their rules, and those rules will sooner or later also come. You will bring them into other social media too. The same rules. So there will be not even a conscious self-censorship that will come along. So, but then on the other hand, that's society what it is. We can choose not to follow those rules. We can choose other media, other social media to sort of counteract that with. But that also requires that we actually take that initiative.
It does, and it's
to develop other forms. I also know that a lot of people start communities like small groups and like secret groups on Facebook where they put up all kinds of political stuff, porn and everything. So you can have porn on Facebook if you have a secret group.
That's interesting.
But, yeah,
as long as you don't get caught, basically.
as long as nobody is saying anything to Facebook.
As long as nobody gets offended.
Well, that's where now we're going back to the original track. If someone
Exactly,
gets
and
offended,
that brings us full circle. And this has been a great discussion. Thank you for the commentary, Kalle.
but I would like to add one more
Go
thing,
ahead.
if it's okay with you. That something that is actually growing a lot, especially in England and in America, and it's coming here because Sweden often imports a lot of American shit, and unfortunately they do this here also. It's like this whole university thing where trigger warnings, safe spaces, cultural appropriation, and all these modern ideas that are very restrictive. Like you cannot dress like this, you cannot say like this, you have to say a trigger warning because otherwise someone will get offended. And then it's all about protecting everyone that just might be offended. And it's like what it really is all about is that a lot of people seem to not be able to be responsible for their own emotions. So they just need everyone else to be responsible for their emotions, which is to me very much not being an adult. These are kids who does not want to be adults. They just want parents to rebel against. And I think that's the whole movement, these university students who want trigger warnings and safe spaces, not to be offended by ideas that might make them uncomfortable and all that crap, which is really is. It's crap. And
Right.
something that really gets me is this cultural appropriation thing, that it's really bad to use something from other cultures that is racist, it's arrogant, it's stupid, it's isolationist, and it's like, no, everyone for themselves. And it's like those people who really love that are the true racists, those who really want to separate people from each other.
So what you're saying, I can't have a pizza because the Italians made one first?
Yeah, well, first of all, only French and English could drive cars. Because the French and the English created the cars. So nobody else would be driving cars. That's the logic, you know. Of course, they wouldn't claim that.
Right.
But that's the logic of it.
I hear you. So wrapping this up, there's another great quote here, but there's an interesting thing about safe spaces, just before we get to that quote. Safe spaces used to be something completely different on university campuses. It used to be a safe space to say anything offensive. It used to be a physical area where you could state opinions that were offensive, repulsive, rejectable, and utterly reviled without facing criticism against your person for them, and have those opinions be intellectually and academically evaluated. This is why we have equal rights for different sexual preferences today. This is why we have equal rights for different genders. This is why we have equal rights for different skin tones, because somebody stood up and said something reviled. Today, those safe spaces have come to mean the exact opposite. And
yes,
if it means anything, I'm offended by that.
The civil rights movement was extremely offensive.
It was.
Negroes wanting the same rights as white, that's extremely offensive. So I mean, in the 60s, when the first black students came to universities, the white students would probably have wanted safe spaces from black students.
I know. So people who want safe spaces and want to be free from anything that discomforts them today are actually preventing tomorrow's liberty, and it's important to keep that in mind. Let's end here with a quote from Stephen Fry, who said, "It's very common to hear people say, 'I'm rather offended by that,' as if that gives them certain rights. It's actually no more than a whine. I find that offensive. It has no meaning, it has no purpose, it has no reason to be respected as a phrase. I find that offensive." Stephen Fry says, well, so fucking what?
Exactly. And you could also say, if I say something offensive and somebody says, "Oh, I'm offended," but what happens? Nothing really happens.
Right.
Nothing
so
happens.
you can't
get offended. That's all.
Right.
It's
so
not like,
what you're saying is you can't take responsibility for your impulse control.
I have leprosy, or I have suddenly got AIDS because I was offended yesterday, or I have a huge headache. No, nothing happens. You get offended, and you can actually choose just to don't give a shit about it.
Right.
That's
you can actually
choice.
choose what offends you or not. What you're saying is essentially, I don't have enough impulse control to be out in public unsupervised. Well, maybe that's stretching it just a little bit, but Then again, just a little bit.
And it's also a manipulative way of getting power.
It is.
Like
It's guilt tripping, isn't it?
Making themselves into martyrs. I'm the victim. I am so offended by your horrible opinion, so I am suffering, and it's your fault. And that's a very manipulative way of gaining power over other people.
It is. And I think this exact sentiment you're describing now, that I'm the victim, so that gives me certain rights, is exactly the sentiment that led up to the attack and murders at Charlie Hebdo, taken to its extreme.
Yes. And the whole idea of killing someone because of a drawing is insane.
It's absurd, isn't it? So, wrapping up the discussion there, thank you, Kalle. This has been a great discussion. I'm Rick Falkvinge. Do visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. This is Liberty Talk 48.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Produced using exclusively free software.